Some ties bind, while others break us in silence. But no bond is worth more than the one we have with our own soul. She was the kind of woman who'd quietly carry the weight of other people's dreams for far too long. But when the weight turned into chains, she had two choices: kneel or walk away. And at 62, she finally chose to walk. Let me tell you the story of Helen Grant, a woman who had lived for everyone else until one brutal afternoon shattered every illusion she had about family, loyalty, and love. And that day was just the beginning. Before we begin Helen's story, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video, especially with anyone who needs a reminder that life doesn't end at 50. Sometimes that's exactly when it begins. Helen Grant didn't. Look, her age. Her soft features and light blue eyes still held a patience that only life's hardest lessons could teach. Her blonde hair, streaked with the wisdom of silver, rested perfectly on her shoulders. To anyone passing by, she'd simply seem graceful, maybe quiet. But inside her lived storms no one had ever truly noticed. For over 30 years, Helen had given herself completely to her adopted son, Jacob. She remembered the first time she saw him, barely a year old, weak and malnourished, bundled in a donation blanket at the community shelter where she volunteered. His birth parents had left him behind like an old box of forgotten things. But all Helen saw in him was hope. She and her then-husband, Alan, had tried for children for years. When adoption became their only option, it was Helen who fought to bring Jacob home. But 2 years after his first surgery, after a long and terrifying battle with his congenital heart condition, Alan changed. He wanted a biological child. Someone who would look like him, he'd said one night, before packing his bags and leaving both Helen and Jacob behind. Painful as it was, Helen chose her son. She worked any job that paid, cleaning homes, waitressing late shifts, even mending clothes for neighbors just to cover rent, medication, and tuition. She made sacrifices others couldn't see, skipping meals, missing birthdays, selling jewelry and heirlooms to make ends meet. But she never once complained. Not when Jacob went to college, not when he got married, and not even when his wife, Erica, started treating her like a background prop in her own life. "You should be grateful," Erica used to say. "You wouldn't even have a family if we hadn't let you stay here." That sentence echoed in Helen's ears the afternoon she walked through the front door, expecting to be greeted with warmth, but instead hearing her son's voice, sharp and impatient. "What do you mean you're not working anymore?" Jacob stood in the living room like a stranger. "You made $8,000 a month. That's half our household income. What are you planning to do? Freeload now?" The wind was knocked out of her chest. She hadn't even gotten to the part where she'd explained that her former employer, Mrs. Chamberlain, a woman who had treated Helen more like a sister than help, had passed away peacefully and, in an act of rare and stunning kindness, left Helen a trust worth over $8 million. But that wasn't what stunned her. What gutted her entirely was the way Jacob looked at her. Like she was just a faucet that had stopped running, a resource that had dried up. "I came home to help," Helen said weakly, more to convince herself than him. "Erica's mentioned she wanted to start trying for a baby soon." "Yeah," Erica cut in, arms crossed. "And we've already arranged real care. Nurses, professionals. We don't need someone who used to vacuum rugs giving health advice." Her voice was cold as marble. Jacob barely flinched. "Honestly, Mom, you should just go back to work. At your age, there's no reason you can't be earning. You're not retired. You don't even have a pension." There it was. It's the truth. Helen had cash stuffed under every crack in their dreams for decades, but never enough left to build one of her own. The kitchen hand towel in her bag still carried a faint scent of Mrs. Chamberlain's lavender lotion. A sensory goodbye she hadn't realized would sting so badly here in her own son's home. "Do you really think I stayed 17 years with that woman just for the paycheck?" Helen's voice came out shaky. She treated me with more love in a week than you've shown me in years. Don't be dramatic, Erica scoffed. Look, you can stay for now, but you'll cover the nanny's cost. I'll find one. We'll just deduct it from whatever you make once you find the next job. Helen stared at both of them, barely breathing. Erica picked up again, this time framing it all like generosity. They'll be good for you. Productive? I know a family looking for an elderly live-in assistant. They'll take you. Room and board included. Jacob nodded. Perfect solution. You get paid. We get breathing room. Breathing room. She had spent her life holding her breath for them, okay? And now they wanted space. I'm 62 years old, Kellen said, each word uncoiling from a part of her that finally remembered it had a voice. I'm not scrubbing anyone's toilets ever again. Beside her, Jacob's expression hardened. Don't be selfish, Mom. You owe us. You threw away Dad. You threw away what could have been a good life. You made this bed. Helen's heart cracked. Jacob didn't know that Alan hadn't been his real father. He didn't know that she gave up biological motherhood to save him. And in that moment, Helen realized the cruelest truth of all. She had spent 3 decades giving someone the best pieces of her soul. And he had chewed through every one like gristle on a bone he never cared to savor. Her voice was ice. We're done, she said, her chest trembling. You made that decision, not me. I'm just finally listening. She picked up the same suitcase she once packed full of Jacob's school books and birthday gifts. And with that, Helen Grant's story no longer belonged to anyone else. A new chapter had quietly begun. Helen didn't cry when she stepped off Jacob's porch with nothing but her old suitcase and the memory of every sacrificed dream weighing on her shoulders. Instead, she walked with the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm. The pause between what's been shattered and the courage it takes to rebuild. For the first time in decades, she had no destination. But she had something far more invaluable: clarity. She checked into a modest inn near the edge of town. The room was small, clean, and smelled faintly of lemon polish. With trembling hands, she reached into the side pocket of her suitcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. Inside it was a letter from Mrs. Chamberlain's attorney and a small flash drive. She had read the words a dozen times already, but now they felt different. More real, to the only person who never saw me as less because I was sick. And never treated herself as less because she was hired help. You became the daughter I never had. Use this gift to live. Truly live. That afternoon, Helen sat across from a cheerful estate attorney who barely hid his surprise. When she handed over the flash drive and the inheritance paperwork, "Do you know exactly what's listed here, Mrs. Grant?" he asked gently. Helen smiled softly. "Yes, I do now." In under 2 weeks, bank accounts had been opened, trusts established, and high-end properties in her name. The same hands that once scrubbed stains now held ownership to 2 luxury lakefront homes. One in Maine and the other in Northern California. But it wasn't about the money. It was what the money represented. Freedom. Word of her overnight success rippled quietly. Some whispered about the older cleaning woman who wore silk now. Some stared in confusion when she test drove a rare vintage convertible down a quiet avenue. She used to dust in silence once a week. Most people couldn't reconcile her new image with the one they had grown used to ignoring. But someone was watching Suzanne Ellerby, Erica's mother, a woman who for years treated Helen like a permanent inconvenience. Her tone always clipped, her comments passive-aggressive, masked as politeness. She used to smirk when Helen showed up for family holidays with carefully wrapped gifts from bargain shops. And now, here was Susan, standing uninvited in the foyer of Helen's California home, pretending to admire the chandelier. "This is new," she said with tight eyes. Helen didn't move. "Can I help you?" "I just wanted to talk," Susan drawled, crossing her arms. "I think we've had some misunderstandings recently." "No," Helen said. "I understood you perfectly." Susan clicked her tongue. "Look, I heard about the inheritance. Of course, I'm happy for you. But let's be honest, we all know. That kind of money can attract some undeserving attention. People might try to take advantage of you. Or forget where they came from. Helen laughed a calm, deliberate laugh that let Susan know the conversation was over before it even began. I haven't forgotten where I came from. It's not willing to stay there anymore. Susan's face hardened. Helen rose from her chair. Would you like to know what it's like to be seen, respected? To have people ask if you need anything instead of what you can do for them? I simply came to extend. No, you came. Two fish, Helen interrupted. Ah, and you brought your net too wide. I suggest you try someone cheaper. As Susan turned and stormed out, another woman approached the porch. Younger, nervous, Ms. Grant. She asked, holding a clipboard. My name is Dana. I'm your real estate agent. Helen raised an eyebrow. You're early? I'm sorry. No, Helen smiled. That's a good thing. Come in. Dana was fresh out of certification, barely in her late 20s, and visibly overwhelmed, which made it all the more powerful when, 2 weeks later, Helen stood proudly beside her as they closed on her second property together. I've never sold anything this high profile, Dana whispered, as cameras flashed at the luxury listing. Honestly, I didn't think you'd pick me. You saw me, Helen replied, and that's the least I could do in return. It wasn't a statement about pride. It was about alignment. For once, Helen chose to uplift someone not because she felt obligated, but because it felt right. She thought that might be the end of it. But cruelty has a way of echoing louder. When ignored across the country, something far darker had begun. Helen's phone started pinging late at night with anonymous messages, hashtags, half-baked accusations. Then came the live stream, Jacob, her own son, sobbing into a camera, claiming he had been emotionally abandoned by his adoptive mother, who had lied to him his entire life. His version of the truth spilled out like oil and water, half reality, half bitterness. She tricked me, he said, between crocodile tears, said she loved me, but she just wanted to rescue someone. I was a project. She abandoned the moment. I grew up. Helen watched in stunned disbelief. Tens of thousands of strangers began liking, commenting, and sharing his version of the story. Donations flowed. Merchandising began. A GoFundMe page titled Son Left Behind raised over $300,000 in 72 hours. He posted throwback photos, misleading captions, spun false emails. Even went as far as to claim Helen had mentally abused him by projecting expectations and erasing his identity. The worst part? People believed him. Her inbox was flooded with insults. Which user? Fake mom. Even death threats. And strangely, she didn't feel anger, just sorrow. Not for herself, but for the boy she once carried out of that shelter. Soaked in July rain. Whispering promises that seemed so easy to keep at the time. She would have gladly given him a home again, but now? He was an empire built on a lie. And Helen Grant was about to tear it down. Helen had never owned a camera, but now her face was framed by one every morning. Her eyes, bright yet steady, stared into the lens as she adjusted the lighting in her guest bedroom, transformed now into her personal truth studio. Behind her, the soft gray walls were decorated with framed photos of quiet moments. Her holding baby Jacob. A worn-out apron hanging in a sunny kitchen. An old birthday card signed, Love You Always, Mom. She didn't rage. She didn't accuse. She simply told the truth. Her first live stream began with a whisper. I won't attack anyone. I won't curse. I won't cry. But I will speak. She paused, the silence louder than any words. My name is Helen Grant. I am 62 years old. I have no criminal record. I raised a boy who once called me mother and now makes a living by convincing strangers I never loved him. She didn't blink. Then she opened the folder on her lap and lifted proof after proof, holding each toward the lens calmly and clearly. Medical. Records showing Jacob's childhood surgeries. each dated and signed by the hospital Helen had worked with directly. Receipts of unpaid bills. It covered for nearly a decade. College tuition. Car loans. A lavish wedding dress Erica insisted on custom designing in Milan. Her own signed affidavit from Mrs. Chamberlain's will, along with audio messages recorded through the years teeny voice notes Jacob had sent her. Loving, joking, vulnerable. Calling her the best mom in the world. He's not lying to survive, Helen said. He's lying to become viral. Within 1 hour, over 60,000 people tuned in. The comments began shifting. Wait, this doesn't line up with what Jacob said. Why would she fake financial documents like this? That's crazy detailed. This woman feels real. I believe her. It wasn't long before Helen's story made the algorithms tilt in her. Favored by her third live stream producers were reaching out. Networks, podcast hosts, documentary offers, but Helen refused them all instead. She focused her newfound platform on something deeper, speaking directly to women her age who had vanished in the eyes of their families, or worse, themselves. What we give isn't always returned, she said in one now viral video. But that doesn't make it less worthy. She began hosting what she called Sanity Sundays. Live talks about boundaries, aging, rebuilding identity, and healing after emotional neglect. Her fan base grew rapidly, not because she sought celebrity, but because she reflected something larger. Something aching inside so many women who had sacrificed their voice for family harmony. While Jacob's empire began to crack under scrutiny, especially after several journalists uncovered inconsistencies in his claims. Strength became a lighthouse. One night during a quiet stream, she ended with a message that sent shockwaves through her audience. Forgiveness may be divine, she said, but so is letting go. And I won't apologize for walking away from someone who lit a fire in my house just to warm their ego. It was then that Jacob made a fatal mistake. He uploaded a long video claiming that Helen's documentation was staged and threatened to sue her for invasion of privacy. Bad move. Helen's attorney, a known-sense litigator named Mira Goldman, who specialized in digital defamation, filed a countersuit immediately. The evidence mountain was insurmountable. Courts moved fast, especially in high-profile cybercrimes. Bang by bang, every financial claim from Jacob was dismantled. Falsified receipts, forged email exchanges, even manipulated audio. Worse, had stolen funds from donors who believed they were helping him fight emotional trauma. A full investigation revealed over 20 fraudulent charges across multiple platforms. The trial was publicized. Though Helen requested no cameras be present, she stood in court with quiet dignity. Mira at her side, wearing the same silk blouse she'd cleaned houses in years before, only now ironed, framed by confidence, and unbothered by judgments. Jacob didn't look once in her direction. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts of defamation, fraud, and public misconduct, Helen simply nodded. All of Jacob's social media profiles were suspended. His merchandise company was dissolved. Donors demanded refunds en masse. Erica divorced him within weeks and moved back in with her mother. Helen never contacted her again. In the final hearing, the judge granted Helen legal ownership of the home she had bought, but allowed Jacob to stay in for years. The very one he had screamed into his camera claiming she stole. You have 14 days to vacate, the judge said. Jacob didn't protest. He just stared blankly. Helen didn't attend the eviction. Instead, she walked the lakefront trail on the opposite coast, where her main home now rested. She listened to the waves. She stopped by a small antique shop and bought herself a porcelain tea set. I'll drink from this on the weekends, she whispered to herself, and no one will ever tell me I haven't earned it. Months passed. Her live streams became less frequent. Not because she quit, but because she didn't need them in the same way anymore. Peace had returned to Helen's days, not loud, not flashy, just present. She meditated. She gardened. She walked. She wrote letters to herself from her younger years. Sometimes she replied to them one evening. While watching the sun stretch across the lake like spilled honey, she opened an old envelope Jacob had once given her. Inside, a childhood drawing of them holding hands with the words, "Me plus Mom forever." She smiled a quiet, full smile. "I don't regret you," she whispered into the wind. "I regret losing myself in you." It was funny how silence, once feared, had become Helen's sanctuary. The little town she chose in Maine hugged a wide lake, its surface shimmering with morning light like it kept every unspoken truth ever whispered near its banks. No one there knew her story when she moved in. And Helen didn't offer it either. Not because she carried shame, but because, for once, she didn't owe anyone an explanation. The house she bought wasn't just beautiful, it was intentional. 2 stories, blue-shuttered windows, a front porch made for storytelling, and a garden, overgrown with possibility. The realtor had seemed almost apologetic about that last detail, but Helen only smiled. "I want something wild," she'd said. "It's more honest than perfectly trimmed." Over the following months, she built a new rhythm. Morning tea with real porcelain. Afternoon walks with herself and no guilt. Evenings curled up with books she never had time to read during the years she was pouring. Serving, fixing, holding, cleaning, saving. And slowly, without fanfare, she began to rediscover herself. She joined a local book club where no one asked about her past but marveled at the way she broke down character motivations. She signed up for language lessons, French, of all things, and found herself smiling at the way the vowel sounds tickled her tongue like old memories resurfacing. At a Saturday farmer's market, she met a woman named Corinne who sold candles and soap and offered a warm, "Oh, honey, I know that you've been through a fire, haven't you?" For the first time in ages, Helen laughed without pretense. Corinne would become the first real friend she'd had in years. The kind who didn't want to lean on her or be rescued, just someone to sit with during rainy afternoons and remind her that joy wasn't just for the young, it was for the free. Still, even in peace, echoes of the past arrived at her doorstep now and then. A letter came in early fall, no return address. But familiar handwriting. It was from Jacob. It wasn't long. "Dear Mom, I don't know what to say or if it matters, but I'm sorry. Not for everything, because I'm not sure I understand how much I broke yet, but for enough, I hope. I'm in a clinic now. They say I disassociated. I burned too many things down. If you don't write back, I understand. And still, I think of your hands. They were always warm." Helen folded the letter gently and tucked it inside her journal without replying. Some days, she reread it. Other days, she left it untouched. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't a single choice but a season. You could walk through it slowly, sometimes backwards, sometimes crying, and still be moving forward. That winter, Helen turned 60-3. She didn't throw a party or make a big post. Instead, she baked a lemon cake, her favorite. Not anyone else's, and danced barefoot round her living room with Billie Holiday on vinyl. She looked in the mirror and saw the laugh lines near her eyes, the silvery threads in her hair, the strong curve of a spine that had bent for others, but never broken. She whispered one sentence aloud. "I am no longer the background in my own life." It was a claim more powerful than any inheritance. Spring came, and with it, a new opportunity. Corinne had connected Helen with a local art center. They need someone who knows how to speak to women about losing themselves and finding their selves. And finding their damn fire again, she'd said with a wink. Helen hesitated at first. What would she say? Who would listen? But she accepted. The first workshop was held in a sunlit conservatory smelling of lavender and courage. 10 women showed up, then 20, then 50. All above 50, all carrying decades of invisible burdens, spoken gently between deep exhales and brave smiles. Helen opened the session with a quote she'd once scribbled during her hardest days. "When you strip away who's needed you, What's left is who you are. What are you willing to build with that? The women clapped. Some cried. They weren't looking for a hero, just someone who had walked through fire without pretending it didn't burn. Helen didn't offer strategies. She offered stories. Her stories, not as blueprints, but as mirrors in which others could see their own strength reflected. Eventually, people began calling her a mentor, a guide, a source of hope. She didn't correct them, but at night, as she curled toes into soft sheets and smelled fresh lavender from a sachet Corrine had gifted her, she reminded herself of the truth. She hadn't been saved by money, or revenge, or even justice. She had been saved by herself, by choosing not to shrink, by staying kind, but drawing her line in permanent ink, by telling the world without needing its applause that she wouldn't be erased, that she had dignity, her own name, and finally, her own story. Life in the lakeside town had become real, not just peaceful, but present. Helen began waking with purpose again, not to rush somewhere, not to meet anyone's expectations, but with a softness that made each sunrise feel earned. Her workshops at the Arts Center had developed into a monthly series named Reclaiming You, tailored specifically for women over 50. No PowerPoints, no lecture halls, just gentle spaces of truth, laughter, and sometimes long-held tears. She often began each group session seated exactly like the others. No introductions, no name tags. Questions. What did you lose while trying to be everything for everyone? The responses varied. Career, friendships, a voice. But every time one answer repeated itself. Me. And every time Helen would simply nod, because she understood. Then she'd say, "Let's find her." By late summer, the town quietly celebrated her. Not in flashy parades or press, but in the way local baristas left handwritten notes on her teacup sleeves. And strangers smiled, like they knew she carried more than just groceries in her bags. Still, Helen lived privately, not secretive, not hiding, just selective. The spotlight Jacob had tried to weaponize against her had long faded. Buried under the truth she patiently let bloom. From time to time, her audience online would request updates. "Are you happy?" they asked. "Do you regret anything?" Her answers were always honest, always thoughtful. "I'm not always happy," she'd say, "but I'm free, and regret only grows where boundaries don't." One message, however, caught her off guard. It came through her website's contact page, with no subject line. The sender's name was Chloe Eller-Basusan's niece, someone Helen had last seen sneering at her during a cocktail party where Helen, still in denim and work shoes, had been serving eau de Uveris. "Hi, Mrs. Grant, I don't expect you to remember me, but I remember you. I was unkind, judgmental, and passive. I was trained to be that way by women I once admired. But watching your journey has forced me to confront parts of myself I didn't know were ugly. Would you ever consider speaking at my women's group in Boston? We focus on professional identity and aging, and I think your story would change how they see their own." Helen didn't respond right away, not out of resentment, but because she knew her answer mattered. She took 3 days, thought about who Chloe had been versus who she might be becoming. On the morning of the 4th day, she brewed her tea, sat at her writing desk, and typed gently, "Chloe, I remember you." Not with bitterness, but with clarity. What matters more to me is the woman writing this email now. She's honest, then I accept, and I'd be honored to share time with your group. That fall, Helen stood once again in front of strangers, but this time in a conference room filled with glass walls, natural light, and women in tailored suits looking surprisingly nervous. Chloe introduced her respectfully, then sat down. Helen took a long pause before speaking. "You're used to applause here," she said, eyes scanning the room. "But I want silence. That's where we hide the good stuff." Some of the women laughed awkwardly. Others straightened. In their seats, "I came today not as a teacher," Helen continued, "but as a reminder. You don't owe anyone an explanation for shining beyond your assigned box, and you certainly don't owe anyone your exhaustion." For the next hour, she told her story not as a weapon, but as a window. She invited them to look through it and see themselves, the mother, the wife, the executive, the caregiver, the sister, the woman. But I ask you one thing, she said in closing. At some point in your life, do something entirely unapologetically for you. Not for legacy, not for duty, not for optics, but for your soul. Let her breathe. When she finished, the room rose in applause. Not the polite kind, the tearful, thunderous kind, because her truth sounded like their longing. Afterward, Chloe approached her quietly. I didn't deserve your yes, she said. Helen smiled. Then earn it now. Do better. Every day. That night, Helen returned to her modest cottage under a starlit sky. Leftovers in the fridge, letters on her desk, a lavender candle flickering in a mason. Jar. She sat on her porch swing and stared out at the dark shimmer of the lake. There had been time when silence used to feel like loneliness. Now it sounded like home. And yet she knew that the final chapter still loomed, the one where she would finally face the part of her that still flinched when she heard the word son. The letter came in early spring. This time there was a return address. The envelope was wrinkled, the handwriting uneven, almost hesitant. But she knew who it was before opening it. Jacob. She could have ignored it, could have filed it away like the first one, tucked between forgiveness and fatigue. But something guided her hands to open it anyway. Mom, I'm 6 months sober now. They say that pills numb the body, but bitterness numbs the soul. I think I was addicted to both. I don't know if healing means we ever go back to before, but I miss your voice. I miss your stories. And I miss being someone you could be proud of. If it's too late, I understand. But if not, I'm here. Still broken, but awake. Jacob. Helen placed the letter on her kitchen counter and poured herself a cup of tea. Hands didn't tremble. It's because this kind of pain no longer shook her stability. She sat with the words for 3 days, not rushing to forgive, not rushing to block him either, simply sitting in the ache and weighing whether peace meant silence or truth. On the 4th day, she wrote back, Jacob, you speak of being awake, but being awake isn't enough. You must choose who you are every day after. I don't hate you, don't even resent you anymore, but I will not be the scaffolding for your conscience. I am here, but I am not yours to use as redemption. If you'd like to meet, it will be on equal ground. One afternoon, one conversation. That's all I offer. She mailed the letter that evening and didn't wait for a reply. She merely returned to her life, her garden, her books, her friends, her breath, and 2 weeks later, he arrived. He didn't knock right away. She watched from the window as he stood on her porch, holding nothing but himself. Finally, a quiet knock, she opened the door. Time had softened him. Not in a redemptive way, but in a human one. He looked tired. Leonor, his eyes unsure. Would you like tea? She asked. He nodded, quietly overwhelmed. They sat on the back porch, nothing between them but a small table and the crisp April breeze. Jacob stared at the lake. I dreamed about this place, he said. Helen took a sip. You knew where I was. He nodded. Internet kept talking. You were everywhere for a while. She let the silence stretch. I told lies, he finally said, looking at her. Some to survive, most to hurt you. Helen didn't interrupt. I needed to believe you were the villain, 'cause if you weren't, then I was the monster. She inhaled softly. You weren't a monster, just deeply unwell, and determined not to look in the mirror, he broke then, head in hands, body swelling with apologies that didn't quite leave his lips. Helen reached out and gently placed her palm over his clenched fists. Her voice did not falter. I want peace, Jacob. Not rewrites, not guilt-fueled reconciliation. Peace. I nodded. I don't deserve it, maybe not. But life keeps offering it anyway. That's the grace. He looked at her with eyes that had once known her as a goddess, then forgot she existed altogether. Could this ever be fixed? No, she answered quickly, not cruelly. But something else can grow where it once broke. He didn't stay long. It's just an hour. They didn't plan future meetings. They didn't take a photo or talk timelines. But when he left, they shared a single gesture. He kissed her hand, reverently. Like he remembered she had held him through storms he never understood. Helen stood there long after he'd gone, not waiting, not hoping, just standing still in her own wholeness. Months passed. She never heard from Jacob again after that day. But the weight she'd carried evaporated, not out of reunion, a resolution. And with that, it truly began. Her afterward dot, Helen sold the California house shortly after and gave large, anonymous donations to domestic worker shelters and single mother advocacy programs. She didn't want credit. Just results, her main home became her sanctuary. But also a creative retreat. She published a book, not a memoir, but a collection of reflections titled Notes to the Woman I Forgot to Be. It hit bestseller lists within the first month. Women sent testimonials, gratitude letters, stories of cycles they ended after hearing hers. In one book signing event, an elderly woman whispered, "You gave words to feelings I had buried for decades. My daughter and I talk again because of you." Helen smiled, not humbly, not modestly, but proudly, because what she had sown in pain, she had harvested in purpose. Her legacy wasn't a mansion or a viral video or a courtroom victory. It was a voice. Her voice. And as she celebrated her 65th birthday, surrounded by a small chosen family, Corrine, Dana, the real estate agent turned close friend, women from her workshops, neighbors who adored her, she stood up at the end of the evening, a slice of cake untouched on the table, and simply said, "I lived most of my life chasing approval. Then I lived through rejection. Now, at last, I live in truth." And that is enough. If Helen's story moved you or reminded you of your own strength, please like this video. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that uplift and inspire. And share this with someone who might be holding their breath, waiting for permission to choose themselves. They don't need permission. Just a reminder, there is no expiration date on rediscovery. Being a good woman doesn't mean being a quiet one. And kindness is not a debt you are doomed to repay with your soul. Your story matters. Still, always.